Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely.
So it's this English learning podcast called Daily Money Briefing.
Huh. Interesting. Okay.
It's actually pretty cool. You get the
Yeah.
financial news and kind of a language lesson all in one.
Oh, I like that. Sort of killing two birds with one stone.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into quite a stack of sources today,
Mm-hmm.
pulling out the key insights from recent economic and trade news. Now, there's a lot happening, but we're focusing on some, well, significant developments centered around South Korea.
Right, because they really do have global implications.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So think of this deep dive as your shortcut, you know,
Hmm.
to understanding these pieces of the global economic puzzle quickly and clearly.
Got it.
What stands out to you initially?
Well, what's fascinating to me is how these different actions, you know, taken in different places,
Yeah,
or even different parts of one country's economy, they're all sort of interconnected.
right.
We're seeing these responses to global uncertainty playing out in pretty distinct ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with a big one then from the U.S., this legal challenge with some major trade impacts.
You mean the Court of International Trade ruling?
Exactly. A federal trade court just struck down a specific set of tariffs.
Right. The court ruled that the administration overstepped its authority, specifically under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA.
The IEPA. And the thinking was that this law, usually for national security emergencies, wasn't the right basis for these reciprocal tariffs.
That's precisely it. The court said it wasn't the proper basis here.
Okay, and this ruling, according to what we're seeing, it invalidates tariffs on countries like Canada, Mexico, China, plus some duties linked to synthetic drugs.
Yeah, sometimes called the fentanyl tariffs. The court was pretty clear. Lift them permanently, executive order needed within 10 days.
And it's interesting who brought the suit: American small businesses and states like Oregon and Nevada.
Right. And what's really key for this deep dive, the direct result is, well, it's highly likely the U.S. will now remove that 10% base tariff currently on South Korea under this specific authority.
Okay, so that one goes, and also a planned 15% tariff linked to it.
That, too, seems likely to be removed based on this ruling.
So that specific trade pressure point for South Korea might ease up. But hang on, the tariffs under Section 232, those are different, right?
Completely different basis.
The ones covering steel, aluminum, automobiles, they remain firmly in place.
Exactly. That's a crucial distinction to make. Those aren't affected by this IEPA ruling.
Got it. And it's not over yet, is it? The White House has already filed an appeal.
Yes, they're strongly opposing the ruling. So this sets up a legal fight, really challenging how presidents can use these emergency powers for trade policy. It's definitely expected to reshape, future global tariff talks.
Okay, so one area to watch. Let's shift gears now from a U.S. legal challenge to monetary policy within South Korea. The Bank of Korea just made a move.
A pretty significant one. They cut their benchmark interest rate by 0.25 percentage points.
Okay, bringing it down to 2.5%. And this comes only 3 months after their last cut, right? That seems fast.
It does signal a growing sense of urgency, yeah.
And the reason seems pretty straightforward. The Korean economy is expected to grow below 1% this year.
So the central bank is now clearly prioritizing economic stimulus. That's the takeaway.
Right. And what's interesting here is that they're doing this even though there are still concerns about rising housing prices.
Yeah.
That was a big issue before.
It was, but the sources indicate stimulus is now the top priority. The Monetary Policy Board even hinted that, persistent downward pressure might mean more cuts later this year.
Wow. Despite other potential issues like growing household debt and maybe foreign exchange volatility.
Yeah, those challenges exist. But the bank seems to view inflation as relatively stable right now, which gives them room, they feel, to make these cuts.
And that view on growth must be pretty serious because they sharply revised their GDP forecast for 2025 down.
Very sharply, down to just 0.8% from a previous projection of 1.5%. That's a big drop.
What are the reasons?
Weakening domestic demand and external uncertainties. Global factors, basically. It really shows how concerned they are about this slowdown.
Okay, so we've got this potential easing of some specific tariffs from the U.S. side, and then the Bank of Korea actively cutting rates to boost domestic growth. Let's bring in the third piece, South Korea's National Pension Service, the NPS. a big shift in their long-term strategy.
Yeah, the NPS, it's one of the world's largest funds. They're set to lower their target for domestic stocks, just slightly, for 2026 from 14.9% down to 14.4%.
Okay, a small percentage change, but for a fund that size.
Exactly. It represents a lot of money, and it's part of this broader long-term asset rebalancing plan they just approved.
And the goal behind this shift, what are they trying to achieve?
It seems to be about boosting returns, getting more exposure to overseas equities, so international stocks, and also alternative investments, think private equity, infrastructure, things like that.
So favoring potentially higher risk assets, but also potentially higher return ones.
Precisely. This midterm plan, running from 2026 to 2030, clearly leans that way. And it follows some reforms from March aimed at increasing their total assets anyway.
And the underlying driver here is the government really wanting to maximize investment returns to delay pension depletion, making the fund last longer.
That seems to be the core objective. They're making a strategic bet that better long-term returns might be found outside of South Korea, or at least they need more diversification globally.
Does this involve changing their overall return target?
It does. The fund's target rate of return is actually being raised from 4.5% to 5.5% annually, starting this year.
So that small shift in domestic allocation is part of a bigger push for higher yields globally, essentially to ensure the fund's long-term health. Billions potentially moving into global markets.
That's the picture, yes. Seeking higher yields to maintain solvency down the road.
Okay, so let's recap. We've looked at a U.S. court ruling that could ease some tariffs on South Korea. We've seen the Bank of Korea cutting rates to stimulate a slowing domestic economy.
And we've got the huge National Pension Service shifting its investment strategy, looking more globally for higher returns.
Right. It paints a picture of, well, a really complex global economy.
You see these distinct actions, a court, a central bank, a massive pension fund, all trying to navigate this period of uncertainty in their own ways.
So here's maybe the final thought to leave you with. How do these three moves, which seem pretty separate on the surface, the legal challenge to trade policy, the inward-looking monetary stimulus, and this outward-looking global investment shift by the pension fund, how do they each reflect different strategies for dealing with economic headwinds? And maybe more intriguingly, how might they actually interact or influence each other in ways we don't quite see yet?
Yeah, that interaction is the really interesting part. Something to definitely keep mulling over.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.